1 Peter chapter 4, as we're continuing our study through the book of 1 Peter, and we're going to just continue all the way through. We will be looking at 1 Peter chapter 4 as a unit today. And of course, when Peter wrote this letter, it was a letter. It wasn't written in chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those were added later for convenience sake. But in this chapter, there's basically 3 paragraphs, and those 3 paragraphs are going to form the outline and the main points of our message today. The title of the sermon, it was in no way connected with the presentation you just heard, but notice the title of this message today is Arming Yourselves for the End. Arming yourselves for the end. Now, immediately, you might be thinking thoughts of, I'm going to preach on, the right to bear arms. Everybody go out and buy a gun. Well, I'm not against you going out and buying a gun. Might not be a bad idea. That's not our point here today. But presenting arms was a ministry to the military, and yet it just happened to fall when we were going through this text of Scripture. And the title here is Arming Yourselves for the End. And I'm not talking about a physical arming. I'm talking about a spiritual arming. In verse 7 of our text, it says, the end of all things is at hand. And the word is teleos in the Greek. The end of all things is at hand. If you only have an opportunity to learn a few Bible words, here's one you should learn, teleos. It's all throughout the New Testament, sometimes translated perfect, sometimes translated mature, but it basically means to reach the end for which you were designed. God designed everything with a purpose in mind. All of creation is moving toward the designed end of God, and your life is too. Now, I am sure that in Peter's mind as he was penning these words, he was thinking about the end of the age. We've seen that in 2 Peter chapter 3. He writes about the end of the age and the elements burning with fervent heat and that dramatic, climactic coming of the Lord Jesus Christ to end the age. I think that's what Peter had in mind. But not only that applies today, but I think our own end also. I don't know how many of us are going to be alive at the coming of the Lord. I don't know if that's the end that you and I will experience while we're alive, but all of us will have an event happen in our lifetime, and that's the end of your lifetime. I don't know if Jesus is going to come in my lifetime, but I know if he doesn't, I'm going to die in my lifetime. That'll be the period at the end of the sentence which constituted my life. I'm dead. That's the end. And I believe Peter would say some things to us today, not only about the end of all things is at hand, the coming of the Lord, that's verse 7, but a part of those all things is you and I should live as if the end of our life is somewhere near. Now, I know the Bible speaks about 70, maybe 80 years God gives us, and anything beyond that is kind of a bonus. You're in overtime of the game there a little bit. 70 to 80 years is what he has spoken about. And so we can look at our lives and we say, well, I'm this years old right now, and so how many years given do I have left in terms of just the average lifespan? And it's good at times to say, what do I want to do at that time? My end is nearing. I'm not saying I'm going to die tomorrow, but we reach that point where we say, well, am I in the last third of my life? Am I in the last quarter of my life? Is my end nearing? How will I end? What will that portion of my life be like? Will it be fruitful and influential for the kingdom of God, or will I just kind of fade away, or will I stumble and fall? Recently, I was in Uganda, and I had something very touching that I got to experience, and I'll go ahead and say their name because I believe they're saints of God, but I would get up early in the morning and just for my own quiet time, and I had a little plug-in thing to heat up some water so I could have some coffee, and I'd go out on this patio and just sit under the stars and pray, and before the sun would come up, Ron and Shirley DeVore would come down, and they would sit there also. And at first I thought, well, maybe I should leave. This seems like a very private time to them. Because every morning when they're there, of course they travel, but every morning when they're there, they get up and they have their devotions privately. They each pray, they each read, and then they go downstairs and grab a cup of hot coffee, and they go out on this porch area, patio area, and they watch the sunrise together. And they hold hands with one hand, and they hold their coffee cup with the other hand. And just as man and wife, servants of God, after many years, they enjoy every morning watching the sunrise together. And I somehow felt like I was intruding upon this very special time between the two of them that they would have every morning. And yet they assured me, no, stay here. We want you to enjoy the sunrise with us. So we did that every morning. And I heard them talking with each other, laughter, and do you remember when? And we should pray about that. And yes, we got to do this. And I thought, here is a man and a wife in the twilight of their years. And God might extend their life a long time, but naturally speaking, they would look to be somewhere in that beginning, the twilight of their years, having to go through some transitions. And yet, here they are every morning watching the sunrise, talking about God, talking about what He's doing in their life and how they can serve Him, and also enjoying memories of how God did this, that, and the other thing. I was touched by those times. And I could not help but believe that's the way to end right there. God, help me to live in such a way that when I'm at the twilight of my life, that's my ending. We're hand in hand, and we're still talking about serving God and remembering the goodness of God and celebrating the breakthroughs of God, and yet still dreaming our dreams and pursuing our vision. And that's the way it should end. That's the way it should end. It shouldn't end by just sitting in front of a TV, retired, just coasting out our days. No, everything that God has put into us over the years, and everything we've learned and experienced, and the wisdom and the prayer and the interaction with God, and the failures and the pain and the breakthroughs, all of it put together should somehow culminate in those twilight years to give us a life of influence and a time in our lives of reaching out and being an influence to somebody else. That's a good end, isn't it? Studies have shown that 1 in 4 Christian leaders only 1 in 4 end well. There's a battle going on for how you're going to end. There's a battle going on as to whether or not you will end well, or whether you will end just okay, or whether you will end having stumbled. 1 in 4 finishes well. And when I read that statistic, it humbled me, it challenged me, and it made me cry out to God, God, help me to be that one. I don't want to be one of the 3. I don't even want to be one of the 3 that doesn't stumble, but just kind of coasts out the days and just kind of fades away. No, the last portion of your life should be that portion of life of influence, where God has put within you a deep reservoir of all that He's done over the years, and now it can come out to affect another generation. That's what I saw in Ron and Shirley DeVore. I not only saw a husband and wife that loved each other and kept their marriage fresh and learned to forgive and put up with and endure one another throughout the years of marriage, and yet there they sit on their porch watching the sunrise hand in hand. A depth of love that few people in this world ever experience. I want that. Maybe you want that too. And maybe you're already widow or widowed, and maybe you think, well, I can't have that. No, but you can still end well. The end of all things is at hand, and there's a battle for how you will end. And Peter here tells us what we need to do to arm ourselves for the end. I think of a negative example. I gave you that positive example of Ron and Shirley DeVore. But I think of Hezekiah from the Bible. What a terrible end. What a waste. One of the greatest kings in the history of Israel, Hezekiah. His achievements militarily, his achievements architecturally, his achievements bringing revival to the nation, and Nehushtan getting rid of all the idols were incredible. He was a great king, and yet he was about to die. The prophet came to him and said, "Thus saith the Lord, get your house in order, you're going to die." And so he goes and he stands in a corner. He has some disease that has something to do with a boil. We don't know what it was. But he goes and stands in the corner, and he says, "Oh, God, remember all the good I've done for you." He's begging for an extension of his life. God says, "I'll give you that extension. I'll give you 15 more years." And God even gave him a supernatural sign to demonstrate that God was going to make good on his promise of 15 more years. So Hezekiah has 15 years. He knows the end is near. 15 years, it's what I've got. What are you going to do with it, Hezekiah? And what does he do with it? It would have been better had he died. The Bible says he did not show the Lord due benevolence for the kindness shown him. He got proud, he boasted, and he stepped out of line. It says the Lord left him to tempt him to see what was in his heart, and he failed the test. He didn't do well. He didn't finish well. But here's the tragic thing. He knew he had 15 years to train that boy that was born. He knew the boy that was born in those years would be the heir to his throne, would carry on whatever legacy he had. He knew he had 15 years. Did he use those 15 years to pour his wisdom and scripture knowledge and interaction with the prophets and all that God had done? Did he use that time to pour into that boy to make him a man of God? No. And Manasseh, his son, became the worst king in the history of Israel, plunged him into captivity, worse than Ahab or any other king in Israel's history. He wasted the years of his life that should have been the most influential. Why am I preaching this hard today? Because I don't want you to waste what should be the most influential days of your life. And you might say, well, I can't get around like I used to. I know that. I can't either. I don't admit that too loudly, but I can't either. Well, I can still go out there and play basketball. The trouble is it takes me like 2 or 3 weeks to recover. And I have pain in areas I didn't even hurt. There's no injury. There's just pain. So I know what that is. And now you got to adjust your schedule a little bit. And I'm not against retirement. But understand this. The end of all things is at hand, including your end. How are you going to end? Arm yourselves for the end. Take up some weapons so that you end well. There's a battle for how you're going to end. And only 1 in 4 end well. So you be that one. But you got to arm yourself to get there. And Peter is going to tell us how to arm ourselves so that the last portion of your life can be the fulfillment of all that God has done throughout all the years. And you can be an impact on another generation. Don't waste it. Something breaks within my heart when people just kind of resign themselves to sitting on a couch watching TV, or even said something a little more wholesome like living for golf. I'm not against golf. I just can't play it. I'm not against it. I like sports. Especially this year. It was a good year. And I'm not against that sort of thing, but don't let your whole life revolve around a golf course. It's the kingdom of God. Don't let your whole life revolve around a soap opera or some game show. It's the kingdom of God. How are you going to end? That's the issue. Only 1 in 4 end well. How will you? Arm yourself for the end. Well, let's see where we get this. And I'm going to give you 3 little points today based on each paragraph here. Arm yourself for the end. Look, verse 1. I'll show you where I'm getting this phrase. Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind, for he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. He says, arm yourself with the same mind. And that word to arm yourself, hoplizo in the Greek, it literally means to take up weapons in preparation for battle. He says the end of all things is at hand. There's going to be a battle. You're going to be in it, so arm yourself. What is that battle? The battle is how are you going to end? The enemy would love for you to stumble and fall. And if he can't get you to stumble and fall, he'd love for you to just resign yourself to fading away. What God wants is that you end your life well, that you end your life serving God, that you end your life influencing others, that you end your life taking the rich deposits that God has invested in you and giving them to others. That's the battleground right there. How will you end? And you're here today, you're alive today, you're going to make it through the service so you can decide, how am I going to live from this day forward? How am I going to end? You don't decide how you're going to end at the end. You decide how you're going to end now. I don't care if you got 50 years left or 5 years left. You don't decide how you're going to end at the end. You decide how you are going to end now. So arm yourself for the end. Now, you see all the scriptures about, on the screen, this word hoplizo, and it's used about weapons, actually, putting on weapons to do battle. John 18:3, they came to arrest Jesus. They had weapons. The word is used there. Romans 6:13, it's used about our bodies being weapons for unrighteousness or weapons for righteousness. Instruments is how King James interprets that word. Put on the weapons of light. Romans 13:12, armor of light, but it's the same word. 2 Corinthians 6:7, the armor of righteousness. And not just armor, but weapon. That's the word. And 10:4 of 2 Corinthians, the weapons of our warfare, they are mighty to God. They're not carnal. They're mighty to a God in the pulling down of stronghold. This is the word. It has the idea there's a battle that's going to go on. You're going to be in it, so arm yourself. Why are you going to be in it? Because it's about you. Why are you going to be in? Because it's about how you will end. That's the end I'm talking about. I know Jesus is coming. That's what Peter was on his mind, and that's certainly true, and we embrace that. But how do we arm ourselves for our end? Well, it's an attitude. Notice he uses the word mind. Talking about Jesus, he said, arm yourself with the same mind as Jesus. Philippians 2:5, have the mind of Christ that was in Christ, Jesus. Have this mind. He's talking about attitude. So we could say this, have an attitude. Arm yourself with an attitude. An attitude about what? I'll give you the outline if you promise to listen. Sometimes you're not supposed to give your outline first because people tune you out. But here's the outline. Point number 1, arm yourself with the right attitude about sin. That's verses 1 through 6. And then verses 7 through 11, arm yourself with the right attitude about service, because that paragraph is about service. And then thirdly, arm yourself with the right attitude about suffering. That's verses 12 through 19. So let's look at the first one, 1 through 6. He says, he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. That's how you live in light of the end. Don't live for your own lusts and passions. Live for the will of God. Now, we've looked at that word lust before. It means strong desire. Epithumia, strong desire. 2 Peter 1:4. All the corruption that is in the world came through those lusts. Think about it. The things that brought all the corruption into this age came in through lust. So why should we as believers live for lust? And we talked about 1 Peter 2:11. The lust war against your soul. Again, there's a battle. There's a battle as to how you're going to finish. Abstain from fleshly lusts that war against the soul. 1 Peter 2:11. There's lust. There's a negative connotation. In our times past, we lived according to our former lust. 1 Peter 1:14. Peter talks a lot about lust alluring us away. 2 Peter 2:18. So lust in Peter's mind is always a bad thing. So don't live for human lust, but live for the will of God. Galatians 5:17, there's a war going on inside of us. And the spirit lusts against the flesh against the spirit. And when the flesh is lusting against the spirit, you can't do what you want to do. You're losing the war. You got to learn how to arm yourself. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Romans 13:14, put on the Lord Jesus Christ. Make no provision for the flesh and the lust thereof. See, there's a negative thing. Those strong desires that are always for something that God has not given or promised. And so we don't live for human desires. We don't live for human lust. We live for the will of God. Watchman Nee put it this way. It's a powerful statement. He said, obedience to the will of God is the greatest demand of the Bible. And as you read through the Bible, time and time again, you'll see that that is absolutely true. Remember the crowd that was gathered around Jesus in Matthew 12, and someone came to Jesus and said, hey, your mom, your brothers, they're out there. They want to talk to you. And Jesus said, who is my mother? Who are my brothers? But those who do the will of God. Doing the will of God should be the passion of our life, especially in that last third, those twilight years. I want to do His will. I want to die doing His will. That's the end. There's a battle for it. So arm yourself. Well, let's look at the first one. Arm yourselves with a right attitude toward sin. We left off in verse 2, but he goes on in verse 3 through 6. For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walk in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelry, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. They will give an account to Him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this reason, the gospel was preached also to those who are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. We talked about that last week. But notice what he says, arm yourselves with a right attitude concerning sin. And he tells us right off the bat what that attitude should be. The attitude that we should have towards sin is simply this: I am dead to sin. He uses Christ and Christ's suffering. Christ suffered that He might cease from sin. Literally what he says is not that Christ ever sinned, but He suffered to put an end to sin. Remember what Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24. Christ suffered so that you might die unto sin. And so the first attitude that we should arm ourselves with has to do with sin. I don't look at sin and say, oh, that's attractive. How close to it can I be? Too many Christians spend too much time trying to figure out how close to sin they can be. No, we are to be dead to sin. We are to be able to declare what Paul said in Galatians chapter 2:20, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Why did Christ suffer and die? He suffered and died to cease from sin. Not his sin, our sin. We are to be dead to sin. So how can we live any longer therein? Romans 6:2, may it never be. How shall we who died to sin still live in it? Verse 11, even so consider yourselves to be dead to sin, but alive to God through Christ. Now those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and lusts. Galatians 5:24. Colossians 3:3, you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. All throughout the New Testament we see this teaching that if you are a believer, your attitude should be you're dead to sin. Christ died in your place. You somehow mysteriously were a part of his death. When he died, your old nature was crucified. And so you are to consider yourself dead to sin. Reckon yourself dead to sin. Here's a little helpful hint. When you're tempted, at the moment of temptation, and psychologists, people who study the brain, would tell you that most temptations only last a few seconds. If you can fight it off for just a few seconds, you won't do it. But if you start feeding it and giving into it, it grows stronger. Here, the next time you're tempted, just do this. Quote the scripture, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live. Yet not I, Christ lives in me. I'm crucified with Christ. I tell you, by the time you quote that scripture a couple of times, you will have gotten through those key seconds of temptation. But if you want to be alive to sin, you're going to not end well. If you want to somehow have little baby sins on the side that you give a little Gerber food every now and then, keep them just alive in case you want to enjoy them. No, you're not going to end well. You got to be dead to sin to end well. And this is what he's teaching. Arm yourselves. Notice this is armor. Arm yourselves with the same mind Christ suffered, that there might be a cessation of sin. Why did he die? We saw that in 1 Peter 2:24. He died he suffered so that we would die to sin. So what is your attitude towards sin? Is it still attractive to you? Look at the next point he makes in verse 3. He says the time of our past should have sufficed for living for sin. Verse 3, for we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, walking in lewdness and drunkenness and all that. You know, there's a saying now, and I'm a little slow to catch on to new sayings, so this a new saying to me, but it's probably old by now. But here's the saying, been there, done that. Have you heard somebody say that? Been there, done that. What do they say? I'm not interested in doing that anymore. Why not? Been there, done that. If you want to arm yourself with a proper attitude towards sin, when temptation knocks on your door, you ought to say, been there, done that. I don't need to go down that road again. I've wasted enough time on sin. How many of you today would acknowledge, I've wasted enough time on sin? You look at what sin has cost you. You look at what you've paid for sin in the past. Look at what sin did to you before you came to Jesus. Why do you want to go back to it? Because you get thinking differently. The enemy plays with your mind and shows you all the attractive parts of sin, and you set aside the shame and the guilt and the brokenness and the pain. Here's what Paul says about it, Romans chapter 6, verse 21. He says, what benefit were you deriving from the things of which you're now ashamed? For the outcome of those things is death. Say, well, I used to be an adulterer. Well, why do you watch that stuff today then? Well, I used to be a liar. Well, why do you bend the truth today then? I mean, you think about it. You've wasted enough of your life already on sin. Don't waste any more. You've paid enough of a price in your life for sinful things. Don't pay any more. We should have this attitude, hey, my past life before I came to Jesus, that suffices. I've been there, I've done that. I don't need to go down that road again. And in 2 Peter 1, 9 and 10, he says if you're not continually adding to your faith, you're going to be like one of those people that forgets you were once cleansed. You'll forget. Don't ever forget what it means to be cleansed. Don't ever forget what it means to be free. And yet we were tempted to go back. Ephesians 2, it says, you were dead in trespasses and sins in which the one time you walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now is at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature the children of wrath like the rest of mankind. You want to go back to that? You used to be a child of disobedience. You used to live only for lust. So now live for the will of God. What is the proper attitude? We should arm ourselves concerning sin. I've died to sin. I don't need it anymore. I've been there, done that. I've wasted enough of my life on sin. Why? The end of all things is at hand. I don't have time to waste. I don't know how much time I have, but I know I don't have time to waste. I know sin is all-consuming and all-binding, and sin always ends in death. I don't have time. Neither do you. So that's arming yourself with a proper attitude towards sin. What is our attitude about ourselves? Well, we're new creations. We're the new man in Christ. We're free. We're the bride of Christ. We're the children of God, not the children of disobedience. Why do we want to go back? Remember that ugly, repulsive picture that Peter painted for us in 2 Peter 2? Sure you remember it. You don't want to remember it, especially before lunchtime, but you remember it. If you go back to your sin, you get all entangled up. You're like a dog going back to vomit. And think of that picture. I already threw this up once. Why do I want to eat it again? Isn't eating it enough once? Isn't it enough to have partaken of these sinful things once? Why do I want to be drawn back into it? Arm yourselves with a proper attitude towards sin. Sin is not your friend. Sin is your enemy. It's a battle. Sin will cost you in the last stage of your life. See, you don't know how much time you have to recover. Sin could cost you something for all eternity. Arm yourself with proper attitude towards sin. Don't be the dog going back to the vomit. And then he says in verse 4, all your friends, the people that you used to run around with, they're going to think it's strange when you don't run with them to the same flood of dissipation. I marvel at that word flood. I never thought of it as a flood. But see, once you start letting sin trickle back in, it soon becomes a flood, a current that'll take you away. And you'll end up smacked up on the rock somewhere, far from where you wanted to be. And will you have enough time to recover? The end is near. Arm yourself for the end. There's a battle for how you will end. So arm yourself. And keep this in mind. Look at verses 5 and 6. Everybody's going to give an account to God. You need to remember that. It says Jesus Christ is coming back again to judge the living and the dead. 2 Timothy 4:1. Every one of us will stand before the judgment seat of Christ to give an account for what we've done in our bodies. 2 Corinthians 5:10. And don't judge other people, but know that we all must appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Romans 14:10 through 12. All of us will give an account of our life before God. And by the way, that accounting of our life includes the last third of it. God doesn't say, oh, you lived for me and you worked well for me for all your life, so you can take the last few years of your life off. No. Live to the end. There's a battle for how you will end. So have a proper attitude. Arm yourself with a proper attitude about sin. Number 2, second paragraph here. Let's read it together. Another thing we need to arm ourselves. And here we could title this, Arm Yourself with a Proper Attitude Towards Service. But the end of all things is at hand, verse 7. Therefore be serious and watchful in your prayers. And above all things, have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without grumbling. See, that's attitude. For each one has received a gift. Minister it to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. If anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracle of God. If anyone minister or serves, let him do it with the spirit, with the ability which God supplies, that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belong the glory and the dominion forever and ever. He says this, have a proper attitude, arm yourself with a proper attitude about serving. As long as you have breath in your body, there's something for you to do for Jesus. You might not have as much strength as we used to, but we want to live out our days all the way to the end. And by the way, if you're here listening to this message and you're a really young person and you're telling us, oh, I got 60, 70 years left, yeah, live all of it for Jesus. You'll never regret that. But we will regret the time we spent doodling away. We will regret living for sin and self and the desires of the human being, human desires, not the will of God. There's a battle. You're in it whether you like it or not. Arm yourself. Arm yourself with a proper attitude about service. After all, Philippians 2, we quoted it earlier. Have this mind in you, which was in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, made himself of no reputation, humbled himself, came in the fashion of a man, humbled himself, came in the fashion of a servant. He served. What is your attitude toward serving? Well, before we even get into what we usually think about serving, look at verse 7. Prayer. Prayer. He says, be watchful and be sober. We talk about these words in another lesson, so I'm not going to get into them. But he says, be watchful and be sober. Don't let your mind be filled with intoxicants, and be alert when you pray for the purpose of prayer. There's everyone in the sound of my voice. I don't care how much physical strength you have, you can still do the most important thing a Christian does. You can pray. And I make no reservations, no exceptions, no apologies for that statement. The most important thing a Christian can do is pray. And so if you have a proper attitude about service, it begins with prayer. Prayer really does make a difference. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 2, he says, devote yourself to prayer and be watchful in prayer. In verse 12, he gives an example of a man. He says, he wrestles for you in prayer. He's engaged in battle on your behalf, and it has to do with prayer. So keep your mind alert. Keep your spirit clean for the purpose of prayer. All of us can be people of prayer, and prayer makes a difference. And I love the quote by S.D. Gordon. S.D. Gordon said this, you can do more for God after you've prayed, but you can do no more for God until you've prayed. And I think Peter's pattern of writing here bears that out. Before he talks about hospitality, before he talks about speaking ministries, before he talks about helps ministry, he says pray. Stay alert in prayer. Now, think about Peter's life for a moment. He says, be watchful in prayer. Where do you think he heard that? Where do you think he learned that? You go back to Matthew chapter 26, and Jesus invited Peter to go with him to pray. And Peter fell asleep. And Jesus said, what? You couldn't wait and watch and tarry for 1 hour? Wow, that's convicting. Jesus seemed to think an hour was a minimum. You couldn't pray and watch and tarry with me for 1 hour? You couldn't even do that? And then he says, watch and pray that you don't enter into temptation. I think Peter remembered those words when he was writing this letter. You want to serve the Lord? Pray. It begins with prayer. To have a proper attitude about service, it begins right here. I can't do it on my own, Lord. I need you. And we need to wrestle in prayer for other people who are in their battle. And we need to pray every day for our own daily bread and to be watchful in prayer. What does that mean? It means be alert in prayer, because God will alert you to things that are going to attack you. God will alert you about things in your family that need to be addressed, strongholds that need to be torn down. You can make a difference for generations to come if you pray. Somehow we think prayer is just a little sideline. No, prayer is the main event. Prayer is the main thing that a Christian can do. Everything that is of any power at all flows out of that. And so you can do more for God after you've prayed, but you can do no more for God until you've prayed. So arm yourself with this attitude towards service, that I got to be a person of prayer, and I have to be watchful in prayer. Hey, look, this is good news, people. Whatever time you and I have left can be great. Whatever time you and I have left, we can finish well. We can do something that'll last for eternity. But it starts with prayer. And if you're not a person of prayer, you can start right now today. Don't waste another day. You've wasted enough time in the past. Let's go from here. Arm yourself with the right attitude about service. And then he mentions love, verse 8. He says, above all this stuff, all these other things, above all, have fervent love for one another. Love will cover a multitude of sins, quoting Proverbs 10:12. Peter's already said a lot about love. You're born again, purifying your souls in 1 Peter 1:22 unto a sincere love. We're told to love the brotherhood, 1 Peter 2:17. I like 1 Peter 3:8. It says, love and be tender-hearted in humility. Keep your heart soft. Men, I want to ask you a question. What kind of an old man do you want to be? Now, I'm not meaning that disrespectful, but we're all going to, if we live long enough, we're going to be old men, right? What kind of an old man do you want to be? Do you want to be the kind of old man that everybody avoids because you're grumpy all the time? Wasn't like it used to be. Well, you aren't either. You aren't either like you used to be. There was a time when people liked you. There was a time when people wanted to be with you. Now, I know I'm exaggerating a little bit, but think about it. Is that how you want to be at the end of your life? Do you want your family to avoid you? Do you want people to move away from you? Or do you want to be the kind of old man that even grown children can't wait to be around? Because there's something of God in your character. There's something of goodness in your heart. There's something of wisdom that comes out of your mind and out of your mouth because of all that God has done in you over the years. But if you get selfish and grumpy, nobody's going to want to be around you in the end, only those that have to be. I don't want to end like that. I want people to feel bad when I die. Don't you? Come on, be honest about it. You know these people that are so super spiritual say, oh, when I die, I want everybody to throw a party. Throw your own party. When I die, bawl, weep, whatever. The Bible says when the wicked die, people rejoice. You know what I'm saying is true. But seriously, you decide now how you're going to end then. You don't decide in the last year of your life how you're going to end. You decide now. Keep your heart tender. Above all this, he says, love. Fervent, hot, boiling love. Above everything. Why? Because the end is near and there's a battle. There's a battle over your heart. There's a battle over your love. And Paul said this in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. He said, I can have all these gifts and faith and miracles. If I don't have love, it profits me nothing. I am nothing. I can have faith, hope, but without love, I'm nothing. Keep your heart soft. We saw this in husbands and wives. Keep your heart soft. 1 John 2:10 says that if you have love, if you're living and walking in love, you're walking in the light, and there's no occasion for stumbling in you. Wow. What a great promise that is. And by the way, it's always better to love than to be bitter anyway. And I know it hurts to love, to weep, to cry, to feel the pain, but it's worth it. Don't die a bitter, old, lonely man. Finish better than that. By loving now. By devoting yourself to caring. By devoting yourself to kindness. By devoting yourself to service. And he mentions 3 examples of service. Look at them with me. The first one is simply hospitality. Arm yourself with the right attitude towards serving. Hospitality. Now, I know if you hear a Bible study about hospitality, they'll go into, in the ancient times, they didn't have Holiday Inn Express, and travelers had to stay in homes, and it's different today. Let's just summarize. I give you a little working definition of what hospitality is today. Let God use your stuff. Whatever stuff whatever stuff you have, let God use it. If you have a nice house, let God use it. If you have a car that runs, let God use it. If you have money, let God use it. If you have other talents or other abilities, let God use your stuff. And let people feel welcome enjoying what God has blessed you with. That's hospitality. Yes, I know it has to do with having people in your home, and that's a part of it. But notice the attitude. Do this without grumbling. Just give somebody a ride that needs a ride. Bring somebody to church. Bake a cake or something and give it to somebody that's discouraged. But use what you got and let God use what you got. That's hospitality. Let God use your stuff. And to be hospitable. Matthew chapter 10, verses 40 through 42 says, even if you give a cup of cold water to somebody in the name of Jesus, it'll be rewarded. If we really believe that, we would be looking for people to give water to. We'd want those rewards. The end is near. Let's finish well. Hospitality. Hebrews chapter 13, 1 and 2, it says, let brotherly love continue. And then he says, don't neglect hospitality, because some have even entertained angels and not been aware of it. What do you have? What have you accumulated in life? Let God use it. Let God use your stuff. Let God use your body. Let God use your mind. Serve. He mentions helps. Helps are things like ushering or cleaning or picking up or putting down or sound booth or all kinds of things that just have to be done so that other ministries can be done. He says, do it with the ability God gives. Do it with the strength God gives. And realize that as you serve that way, you are finishing well. You are investing in something that is eternal. Look at what he says about speaking. If you have a speaking ministry, take it so seriously. Understand that you're speaking for God, that God wants to speak through you. You're an oracle of God. Be serious about that. Have a proper attitude concerning service. I'll close out this point by a testimony. A man who was a dear friend of mine many years ago. He was a brilliant man. His name is Jim McLaughlin, and Jim was a genius, and that's not an exaggeration. He had master's, plural degrees, and doctor's degrees. He taught at some of the prestigious academic institutions on the East Coast, a couple of them. He was an inventor. He had articles published in some of the outstanding journals, a full-page ad on the New York Times about one of his ideas. I mean, this guy was brilliant. And when he was dying in the hospital, I went to see him. He and I became quite close. He was older than I was, but I trusted Jim. And Jim would correct me. Jim cared for me. And I grew to love him too. And when Jim was dying, I just happened to go on a time when his wife had just left the room. And somehow I thought, well, this might be the last time I'm with Jim if God doesn't do a miracle. I think Jim sensed that too. And as it was just Jim and I sat down in a chair by his bed. We weren't talking much because he was so weak. I was just kind of there. And he looked at me, and even though his body was so weak, there was still something in his eyes of life. And he raised a couple of fingers, and he just kind of motioned, come a little closer. And I knew he wanted to say something to me significant. It was one of those moments of, and this is going to be a moment. He's going to say something to me. And so I leaned in real close so I could hear his weak voice, and more with his eyes than his voice. But this is what he said to me. Thank you. And he must have read the question on my face. Why was he thanking me? I should be thanking him. He was such a devoted servant in the church. He did our sound ministry back when we didn't have a building, didn't have any equipment. He would carry all the cassette. Remember cassette tapes, those things you used to have years ago? Those plastic little rectangular things that always get messed up, those cassettes. He would tape all of our sermons, and he would bring all the slave units to church. He would carry them in from his house to his car in all kinds of weather. We didn't have our own building. We had to clean, set up, and take down every time. And he would he'd come hours early to set up. He'd stay hours late to tape and to reduplicate those tapes, and then he'd mail them out. And that's what he did for the Lord. And on that day when he was dying, and he beckoned me near, he said, thank you. I didn't understand what he was thanking me for, so I paused. I didn't even say anything. And he read my face, and he said, of all the things I've ever done in life, now think of who this guy is and what he's done. He said, the most significant thing I've ever done in my life was duplicate your messages and distribute your messages. Thank you. That was the last talk I had with Jim. Thank you. And I realized in that moment how horribly wrong I am as a pastor to take it easy on the congregation when it comes to service. Because you will never be fulfilled unless you're actively serving the Lord. You were created to serve. You were saved to serve. You were called unto good works, and you will not finish well if you don't serve. Oh, you might go to heaven, but you won't finish well if you're not serving. And all of us can serve. It is the high calling of God to serve Jesus Christ with whatever strength we have, with whatever ability we have. No, you're not called to be a platform speaker maybe or an overseas missionary, but every one of us is a steward of the manifold grace of God. What is a steward? Someone who's placed over a house. Someone who will give an account for how that house is managed. And every believer has received from God, and we're stewards of the manifold grace of God. And there's all different facets of God's grace. Every one of us is a steward of God's grace. I want you to end well. I want you to stand before Jesus and hear him say, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Hallelujah. Have a right attitude about serving. It is a privilege to serve. It is an honor to serve. It's not that we have to serve. It's that we get to serve. So you stand before God. You're going to tell him about your golf game. We're going to stand before God and tell him Ellsbury's stolen base percentage. I enjoy that stuff, but that's not what I live for. I want to finish well. I want you to finish well. And we won't finish well if we don't arm ourselves. See, there's a battle over this. There's a fight trying to get you not to serve, not to pray. You and I, we will never, in a million eternities, we will never regret sacrificial service to the Lord. Never. But we will regret being casual about it. We will regret serving only out of convenience, not out of sacrifice. It's for Jesus. It's for our Lord. It's for our Savior. There's a war over how you're going to finish. Arm yourselves with a proper attitude for service up until the very end. Serve. Serve Jesus. It's not about serving me or this church. It's about serving Jesus. Now, you know I've preached this sermon before, and you know I only have 5 minutes left. And now you know I'm not going to get to do point 3, but to mention it. But it's important to mention. Here's point 3. It's verses 12 through 19. You need to arm yourself with a proper attitude about suffering. You need to arm yourself with a proper attitude about suffering. He says, don't think it's strange when you go through fiery trial, as if some strange thing has happened unto you. But when you're suffering in the will of God, he says, rejoice. And think about the glory that's going to come. And we'll pick this up next time. We'll develop it more in a very phenomenal verse, a promise next week. So be here. Man, there's some good stuff in the next chapter. But he talks about suffering and having a proper attitude about suffering. What is your attitude about suffering? When you suffered, you say, oh, why me? You know, somebody could answer that and say, well, why not you? We're all people. Why me? No, we don't want to. Let's just read the text real quick, 12 through 19. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. But rejoice to the extent that you're partaking of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. For you, if you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. On their part he's blasphemed, but on your part he's glorified. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, an evildoer, as a busybody in other people's matters. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter. For the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God, and if it begins with us first, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel be? Now if the righteous one is scarcely saved, where will the ungodliness sinner appear? Therefore let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to him in doing good, still serving, as to a faithful Creator. Very simply put, he said, don't be surprised, but rejoice. Rejoice, because as you suffer with Christ, you can look forward to being glorified with Christ. End well. Suffer for Jesus if that's what he calls you to do, but do it with a rejoicing heart. Don't be ashamed, he says. If you're going to serve with whatever ability God gives you. And keep that joyful attitude, even in suffering. When you suffer in the will of God, the Spirit of God and the Spirit of glory rests upon you. And think also of this, you're being refined. Verse 17, judgment begins with the house of God. We had a whole lesson on 1 Peter 1, 6 and 7, the trying of your faith. It's much more precious than gold tried in the fire, and it will be found unto praise and honor and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. In other words, when the end comes, you'll be glad you suffered. When the end comes, you'll rejoice that you suffered, so rejoice now. Your suffering now will prepare you for greater glory after the end has come. So we need to arm ourselves with a new attitude about suffering. Suffering is not something to be avoided at all costs when it's in the will of God. Notice he clarifies that, in the will of God, not as an evildoer, not as a busybody in other people's affairs. No, when you're suffering in the will of God, rejoice. because we've made a commitment not to live for our own desires, but to live for the will of God. And so here's the last point. Have the proper attitude about commitment and trust. He says, as you continue to do good and you're suffering in the will of God, he says, entrust, commit the keeping of your souls unto Him as unto a faithful Creator. In other words, God, I know you're faithful. And I might be suffering now, but I choose to rejoice that I might end well. Because I believe glory is somehow attached with suffering. Peter makes that very clear, especially in chapter 5. The glory is attached with suffering. So rejoice. As we end, let's summarize. Arm yourselves. Why? There's a battle. What is that battle over? It's over you. It's over how you will end. Let's be determined to end well. So arm yourself with a proper attitude concerning sin. Arm yourself with a proper attitude concerning service. Arm yourself with a proper attitude concerning suffering. Live no longer for the desires of the flesh. Our times past should have sufficed for that. But let's live for the will of God. Would you stand with me, Connie, music team, would you come? And Pastor Lloyd will close us in prayer in a moment. But as we stand in the presence of God, would you just bow your head and close your eyes? I don't know how much time any of us have left, but we have right now. And I believe commitments that are truly made have eternal impact. So will you right now make a commitment to do whatever God shows you to do to end well? You might live 50 more years. Some of you in this room will. If the Lord tarries, you'll live another 50 years. Some of us might not be here next year. I don't know. But make a commitment right here, right now, to end well. The end of all things is at hand. So let us arm ourselves with a proper attitude. If you've never received Jesus as your Lord and Savior, you're not headed for a good end, but you can. That can change right now. If you open your heart this very moment and say, Jesus, I need you. I believe you died on a cross for me. I believe you were raised from the dead, and I need you to be my Lord. Come into my heart, Lord Jesus. He will come. He'll give you a new beginning. You can be a new creation. You can end well. You can. So receive Him. And those of us that have received Him, whether it be a year ago or 40 years ago, run the race. Maybe you say, I don't have strength to run. Well, keep moving. Pray. Serve. End well. Let's worship Him.